This is my database demo. I'd like to start by talking about the ERD. So I've created 12 tables for the established 12 entities. I'll start by explaining the relationship between office and employee. So an office will have many employees, but an employee will be linked back to just the one office. And then looking at employee, which branches off to manager, instructor, and admin staff. So one employee to one manager. Same goes for instructor and admin staff. It's a one-to-one relationship, a mandatory relationship. So a manager can only exist when an employee exists. So the manager is dependent on an employee. Same goes for instructor and admin staff. And it's 0 to 1 or many notation on the end of manager, because an employee could have 0, 1, or many managers at any given time. And then looking at the instructor to interview table, it's a one-to-many relationship. So one instructor will conduct many interviews, and then the one interview will be linked back to just the one instructor. Then looking at interview and client, it's also one-to-many. So the one interview is taken by many clients. The interview content remains the same, so all clients will take the same interview. And then it's a mandatory one-to-many relationship, because the client depends on the interview, so the client can only be registered once an interview is conducted. And then once the client is registered after having an interview, they can begin booking client lessons. So looking at relationship between client and test, it's a one-to-one. So one client to one test only, and one test back to one client. And then it's an optional relationship, because the client can choose to take the test or not. And then also the client can have 0, 1, or many tests at a given time. Then looking at instructor and car, it's a one-to-one mandatory relationship. So one instructor is assigned one particular car. And between car and inspection is a one-to-many optional relationship. So a car may have an inspection, but an inspection must be linked back to one car. And then a car may have 0, 1, or many car inspections, hence the 0, 1 notation on inspection. And then looking at car and lesson, it's a one-to-many relationship. So a car will have many lessons, but a lesson will reference back to one car only. And then 0 to 1 notation, because a car could have 0 or 1 or many lessons. And then looking at lesson and client lesson. So lesson stores the appointment times of a particular lesson. Then that appointment time is used on that day, where it stores the mileage and notes used during the client lesson. And then it's a one-to-one mandatory relationship, so one lesson to one client lesson only, and one client lesson will go back to the one lesson. Now looking at client lesson to client, it's a one-to-many relationship. From one client can have many client lessons, and then the one client lesson will refer back to the one client, but a client may have 0, 1, or many client lessons. And then now we can look at functions, procedures, and triggers. So we'll begin by looking at procedures. I've also created a function to use within my procedure to calculate the age of any employee. The function is basically a date different function, so it takes the current date and the inputted date, divides by 365 to calculate the age. So using that function within my stored procedure called empage, employee age, it takes in the ID of any employee and calculates the age. The procedure is already stored within MySQL, so we can just call the procedure. So call emp age with employee ID number 1 will return the age of 20, and then if we try and calculate the age of, say, employee number 5, it will return age 36. The second procedure takes an input value for road safe cars and outputs result. So called legal cars procedure allows the driving company to search the number of legal cars available. So cars that have taken an inspection but failed the inspection means that the car is not road safe. So this procedure allows the driving school to see all the available cars that have successfully passed the inspection or is still road safe. So we can call legal cars with the parameter y standing for yes, and it will return the number of road safe cars, which is 3, and if we substitute n for no, you can see that there are 2 cars that are not safe. And then now we can look at the triggers. I have created 5 triggers. The first one is after deleting an instructor record, you'd also delete the record from the employee list. So this trigger is called log employee delete. All the triggers are already inserted into MySQL. So now I'll just simply test the trigger through the command prompt. And then we'll first have to insert a test employee, then create the instructor record for that employee we insert, and then we'll delete it after to see if both records successfully delete. So if we insert a test client, well, a test employee rather, okay, query OK, and then if we look at the employee table and check the ID, so the test employee that we're going to use to test the trigger with ID 24, so substitute the ID employee for ID 24, and then create the instructor field for that employee. Okay, so query's okay, and then now we can delete the employee with the ID 24 and see if the record from the employee table here at ID 24 and the instructor with ID instructor 18 but the ID employee 24, both records should delete after this delete statement, which should trigger the trigger. Okay, query's okay. After delete on instructor, so if we look at okay, selected the wrong ID, so selected the employee ID to delete. We'll change that back to, so deleting the ID of the instructor will delete the employee record, which is, yeah, so after delete on instructor, so delete the instructor record should trigger the delete of both records. So if we now delete the ID of 18, which links back to the ID employee of 24, so delete 18, 1 row affected. And then if we refresh this, the ID in 18 should disappear. Yeah, and the employee, this one should also be deleted after I refresh. Yep, so no longer exists, so the trigger works. And then looking at the second trigger, so you basically can't book a lesson before 8 AM or after 8 PM or if the date is already passed. Actually, no, this is an extra comment. So simply the trigger is just can't book a lesson before or after 8 PM. Trigger already exists within the database, so simply test it. So the trigger is check valid lesson time, and here the time inserted will be 7 in the morning, so that's before 8 AM, which should trigger the error message. Yes, so lesson times between 8 AM and 8 PM only. And then looking at the third trigger, can't insert with invalid date. So when trying to insert an interview record, but the date is already in the past, it'll display an error message as well. We can test that trigger now by inserting a date that's already in the past, so the 1st of January 2017, and then paste this. Yep, date input cannot be before current date. And then looking at the next trigger, so after insert, client lesson mileage past value to increment mileage. So looking back at the ERD, this essentially means within the client lesson, that's tracks the mileage used per client lesson. The mileage used within here will be incremented onto the existing mileage value on car, and we'll test that trigger now. So we'll insert a record into client lesson. Well, let's check quickly the car that we want to increment. So within car we have all these cars available. Let's say we take hang on a second, client. Okay, we'll take car number 6 with a present mileage of 20. So the mileage that I insert with client lesson should increment on top of this one if the trigger works. So we'll use ID number 6 for the ID client. Actually no, that ID doesn't exist. So we use ID 5 for the client, and then so inserting mileage 20 and add on top of that, so 20 plus 20 should equate to 40 after the trigger triggers. So if we insert this into the database, okay, 1 row affected, and if we refresh this and check the ID car of 6, it should increment. Yes, so the trigger works for that as well. And then if we look at the final trigger, so this last trigger is to update test attribute client for each test. So this is basically means within the test table, each time a client takes a test, that means a client would have taken the test once. So then within the client, they have a field for test, which counts the number of tests they have taken. So whether they fail or not, the test value will always increment 1. But if they pass the test, then the license status should update to a full license rather than a provisional. And if we look at the clients now, we have all these clients, and then we'll take this last client with a provisional license and has 0 tests. So if the trigger works, it should essentially perform this code and increment the test field by 1. Actually no, it should do this one. So if the test result equals pass, set the license status to full and increment test to +1. And if we insert a record to test, so what we're looking for after is for this field to change to full license and test to become 1. Okay. Unknown test.id